Hey everyone. Tonight we're not walking into a trench or jungle, but into a world where the killer was the air itself. In 1918, people didn't fall with bullets in their chests. They drowned, sitting up in bed, lungs filling quietly like basins under a leaking roof. Streets went silent, doors stayed locked, and milk bottles soured on porches, no one open. This isn't a story of glory or victory, but of breaths that never finished. If forgotten disasters keep you curious, get comfortable and follow me back to the flu that almost erased a generation in 3 short waves. You are there, in the cavernous mess hall of Camp Funston, Kansas. Morning light, a pale, timid gray, filters through high windows. The air is thick with the familiar sense of boiling coffee, institutional eggs, and the slightly stale aroma of damp wool uniforms. A low murmur of conversation fills the space, a symphony of young men talking about training, about home, about the distant shores of France. Suddenly, a sound cuts through the mundane hum, a sharp, unexpected clatter. It's the distinct ring of a metal spoon hitting a metal tray, a sound that, in its suddenness, holds a peculiar finality. Your eyes and the eyes of 50 other men are drawn to the source. You see him, a soldier, perhaps just a few years older or younger than you, his body unexpectedly folding forward at the table. It's not a graceful bend, but a collapse, as if the very scaffolding of his being has given way. The plain, scrambled eggs, still steaming with their morning warmth, slide from his tray, splattering onto his sleeve in a sticky, yellow stain that quickly mixes with the darker, bitter coffee, forming an unsettling, abstract pattern. And then, you witness the detail that will etch itself into your memory. A thin, unsettlingly pink foam, delicate as a breath, begins to slip quietly from the corners of his lips. It's a slow, almost gentle emergence, a soft, foamy border appearing on his face, contrasting starkly with the suddenness of his fall. The entire barracks goes silent, abruptly. It's not a gradual quieting, but an immediate, profound hush, as if a conductor has suddenly brought their baton down. The scraping sound of boots against the rough wooden floor, a constant background noise in the lives of soldiers, stops mid-motion. Every eye is fixed on the fallen man. You watch, transfixed, as his shoulders twitch once, a faint, almost involuntary shudder, then a second time, and then nothing. The twitching ceases, leaving him still, utterly motionless in a way that feels deeply, fundamentally wrong for a young man. A medic, sharp and efficient, rushes forward, his heavy boots sounding loud in the sudden quiet. His first thought, a common one in a mess hall, is choking. A piece of food, a gulp of coffee gone wrong. But as he reaches the man, he discovers something far more disturbing. There is no external obstruction. Instead, the soldier's own lungs are drowning, not in spilled coffee or food, but in something unseen, something no one poured. It's a silent, internal tide. You see his eyes, now wide open, staring fixedly at the rough rafters above, glassy and vacant, reflecting nothing. His skin, a moment ago the healthy flush of youth, is slowly turning a bruised, disturbing violet. A strange, deep color spreading along his jawline and beneath his fingernails, as if pressed in by unseen hands. Outside, the spring wind, still cold and restless, rattles softly against the windows of Camp Funston. It's a sound that suddenly feels like a distant, unheard warning, a whisper that the very air itself, the very substance you all breathe, has subtly, terrifyingly changed. An officer, his face rigid with the need for order, barks out commands, his voice jarringly loud in the continuing silence. "Carry him off," he snaps, urging that breakfast must, inexplicably, continue. His words are sharp, meant to instill discipline, to quash any rising fear. War doesn't pause for one weak constitution. The fallen soldier is swiftly, efficiently carried away on a stretcher, a canvas ghost disappearing from the room. 3 men, those who had been sitting closest to the now empty space at the table, feel a strange, tight constriction begin to gather in their own chests. It's a subtle unease, a phantom weight. But they say nothing, swallowing it down along with the bitter coffee, pushing the feeling deep inside, perhaps hoping to outrun it. The air in the barracks, once just a blend of breakfast and uniforms, now holds a new, unsettling scent. It's the faint metallic smell of iron, like spilled blood mixing with the boiled eggs and damp wool. A scent that, you realize with a cold chill, the barracks will soon come to recognize far too well. A grim signature that will cling to the walls and to their memories. No one thinks to open a window. The morning is still too cold, and coal for heating is, after all, an expensive commodity. A private trying to lighten the heavy air offers a nervous, forced laugh, the sound hollow and brittle. "Guess he couldn't wait for France," he says. A grim joke that dies quickly, flat and unwelcome in the thick, silent air. Somewhere else in the camp, distant but distinct, another soldier coughs, just once. But in the hushed barracks, the sound echoes in your ears, not as a simple cough, but like the sharp, chilling click of a gun being cocked. A silent mourning. Tonight, you will all sleep in the same room, under the same roof, breathing the same air that just inexplicably killed one of your comrades. You will inhale what took him, without knowing, without understanding. The chaplain is not called. It is, they say, only one death. But you can already feel the unspoken dread in the room. By the end of the week, that phrase, "only one death," will become a line no one dares to utter out loud, for fear of its terrible, mounting burden. The piercing, insistent sound of reveille slices through the pre-dawn quiet, a harsh, metallic call to wakefulness. But this morning, the usual scramble of bodies and shouts does not erupt. You hear the bugle, yet in the dimly lit barrack, a profound stillness clings to half the bunks. They remain silent, motionless, a stark contrast to the usual bustle. Those who do stir rise slowly, their movements thick and heavy, as if they are being pulled through invisible mud, each limb resisting the simple act of standing. You watch as one soldier, a robust young man only yesterday, swings his legs down from his upper bunk. But before his feet even touch the floor, a violent tremor seizes him. He immediately drops to his knees, clutching at his ribs, his face contorting in pain. A deep, tearing cough, ragged and agonizing, rips through his chest, shaking his entire frame. It is a sound that tears at the very fabric of the morning. Next to him, another soldier attempts to stand, pushing himself up with visible effort, but his legs buckle beneath him, refusing to hold his weight. He sways dangerously, then leans heavily on the rough wooden bedpost, leaving behind distinct, bloody fingerprints on the worn timber. Dark crimson marks against the pale wood, silent witnesses to an unseen battle. Then, a chilling chorus erupts. Not a scattered collection of individual coughs, but a synchronized, almost orchestrated symphony of sickness. 50 chests begin barking under the same roof, not independently, but as if they are all connected, one single diseased lung struggling for air. The sound fills the barracks, a terrible, rattling roar that vibrates through the very floorboards and up into your bones. The air itself feels thick, warm, and strangely sweet, cloying and heavy with the scent of fever breath, hanging low like a suffocating mist. A sergeant, his voice usually a booming instrument of command, shouts for discipline, for order amidst the chaos. But his voice cracks mid-word, betraying his own weakening state. As he tries to speak, a string of thick phlegm, glistening wetly, lands with a soft splat on his uniform collar, a stark, disgusting sign of his own losing fight. Moments later, the medic walks in, expecting to find the usual malingering, the feigned illnesses of soldiers trying to avoid duty. Instead, his eyes widen in disbelief and dread. He sees young men, strong and vital only hours ago, their lips turning the color of storm clouds, the deep, bruised blue that speaks of a desperate lack of air. Someone, unable to hold it any longer, vomits a watery pinkish mixture onto the floorboards. The sound is soft, muffled by the pervasive coughing, but the smell is sharp and metallic, like old pennies and decay, instantly cutting through the other odors. Outside, indifferent to the unfolding tragedy within, the flag is raised, signaling the start of another day of training, another day of preparing for a war thousands of miles away. But inside, half the platoon can barely inhale, their lungs screaming for air that seems to elude them. In the infirmary, the logbooks are updated, but the notes are chillingly brief, understated. They simply read, "severe influenza," as if the word itself has not yet learned how terrifyingly vast, how monstrously significant it must grow to become. No one tells the newspapers. Wartime censors, ever vigilant, prefer to publish stories of heroics, of valor on distant battlefields, not the messy, ignominious reality of phlegm and disease spreading through the ranks at home. Officers, pragmatic and detached, quickly issue orders for the sick to be packed into medical trains. The priority is clear. They need the bunks, these vital spaces, for the next wave of recruits, the replacements who are still healthy, still strong. The infected must be moved, removed from sight, from mind. The barracks are then swept with a furious efficiency, the soiled blankets changed, the windows, finally, belatedly, thrown open. A rush of cold, cleansing air pours in, but it is too late. Far, far too late for the ones already sent away, for the soldiers already coughing their way across the heartland. The trains that leave that afternoon are not just carrying sick soldiers. You realize, with a cold, sinking feeling, that they are exporting a plague, carrying a deadly, unseen cargo with reserved seats, sending it out into the unsuspecting world. You can almost feel the rhythmic sway of the cramped rail car, its worn wooden frame shuddering gently as it hurtles across the vast, slumbering landscape. Inside, men are packed shoulder to shoulder, a dense, living tapestry of khaki and fatigue. Their breath, warm and heavy, condenses on the frosted windows, forming uneven halos that shimmer in the faint light. A visual representation of the shared air, shared vulnerability. The scent of unwashed bodies, stale tobacco, and nervous anticipation hangs thick in the close quarters. Suddenly, a soldier awakens with a jolt, a sharp, involuntary gasp. He clutches his chest, his fingers digging into his uniform as if some invisible weight, some heavy burden has been suddenly dropped upon him. Each subsequent breath he takes sounds like paper tearing inside his ribs, a dry, raspy, agonizing sound that cuts through the low hum of the train. He coughs violently, a wet, tearing expulsion that he tries to muffle into a handkerchief. But when he pulls the cloth away, he freezes. Staring back at him from the crumpled fabric are faint, horrifying red threads, spider-webbing through the white cotton, delicate as frost patterns, yet stained with an unmistakable crimson. The man across from him, perhaps sensing the terror in his gaze, tries to make a nervous joke, his voice trembling despite his efforts. "Looks like you got shot without a gun," he mutters. The attempt at humor falls flat, echoing hollowly in the suddenly silent space around them. As the hours pass, the air in the rail car grows steadily warmer. A feverish heat radiates from the packed bodies, turning the entire car into a low, slow-cooking oven. It's a humid, oppressive warmth, heavy with the damp wool of uniforms and the rising tide of fear. A medic, his face etched with exhaustion, walks slowly down the narrow aisle, his footsteps careful, deliberate. He stops at bunk after bunk, feeling a dozen burning foreheads, each one radiating a feverish heat that seems to cling to his fingertips. He jots down fever cases in his tiny notebook, a small, inadequate phrase that cannot possibly hold the true weight, the silent enormity of what he is witnessing. You see him pause by one man whose head is bowed slightly, eyes half open. He is sitting upright, almost respectfully. Nobody notices, not at first, because his stillness blends with the exhausted sleep of those around him. It is only when the train lurches unexpectedly, a sudden shift in its momentum, that his body slumps sideways, utterly limp, that the silent, terrible truth becomes clear. They lay him gently on the floor by the door, an improvised morgue, covering his face with a rough blanket. From then on, every time someone needs to pass, they must step carefully over his covered form, a silent, grim reminder of mortality in motion. At the next stop, a bustling station somewhere in the Midwest, workers begin to haul off stretchers. They move with the same brisk efficiency that they would use for crates of ammunition, for ordinary cargo. Supplies, sick men, and death itself are all sharing the same timetable, treated with the same indifferent haste. At small-town stations, you can almost see the local civilians gathered, their faces bright with patriotic fervor. They wave flags, toss flowers, their lungs breathing deep the proud, seemingly clean air, utterly unaware that the infected train is exhaling an invisible poison right into their faces. A station master, fussing over schedules and cargo, complains vaguely about the smell emanating from the cars, but he doesn't complain to the right person, or perhaps to anyone who could truly understand. On a distant telegraph line, the barest whisper of information travels. Unusual illness among troops. But the virus, nimble and invisible, travels infinitely faster. It is already on board the next train, and the next, spreading its insidious tendrils across the continent. Night falls, and the rail car continues its gentle, rocking motion. The sound of its engines throbs beneath you, but now, blended with it, is a new, unsettling rhythm. The sound of dozens of men wheezing in their sleep. A collective, ragged breath that sounds like an army of old men, fragile and failing, trapped within the young, strong bodies of soldiers. These trains, you realize, are rolling relentlessly toward the ports, towards the vast, waiting ocean. And the ocean, you know, is about to meet its most loyal and most deadly passenger. You are now below deck, in the belly of a troop transport ship, a metal behemoth plowing through the vast, indifferent ocean. The air down here has a palpable texture, like a warm, saturated sponge, heavy, wet, and impossibly thick. It clings to your skin, seeps into your lungs, making every breath a conscious effort. It is impossible to escape, to find a pocket of clean, crisp air. You watch a sailor, his face grim with effort, try to climb the ladder leading up to the promise of fresh air on deck. But halfway up, his chest locks in a sudden, agonizing vice. He clings there, suspended between decks, shaking uncontrollably, his knuckles white against the cold metal rungs, his body trembling with the desperate need for air. On the infirmary cots, arranged in crowded rows, young soldiers lie gasping, their mouths wide open, contorted in a silent scream. They are trying to drink the air, to pull it in, but every inhale rattles like broken glass, a dry, tearing sound that echoes in the close quarters. Nurses, their faces drawn with exhaustion and horror, move with frantic efficiency. They tilt men sideways, and a pale, frothy fluid, the color of weak tea, spills from their mouths and noses into buckets that fill with horrifying speed, a constant, sickening flow. The morgue room, a grim space usually reserved for the unfortunate few, overflows almost immediately. They begin to stack bodies in storage closets, in spaces meant for rope and coal, any empty nook or cranny becoming a temporary resting place for the dead. When the sea grows rough, the immense ship pitches and rolls, and the dead, wrapped tightly in sheets, sway gently along with the living. They are tied at the ends like grotesque cocoons, their shrouded forms rocking in macabre rhythm with the ship's motion, indistinguishable from the living in their silent, swaying dance. Each sunrise, a somber procession begins. A line of corpses is brought topside, hoisted from the depths of the ship's hold. The canvas shrouds covering them are already darkening in places, the wet, telltale stains of lung fluid seeping through, making the journey to the deck. Prayers are muttered quickly, whispered words lost in the ocean wind, for there is little time for ceremony. Bodies slide into the churning water with soft, almost apologetic splashes, sounds that the vast, indifferent ocean doesn't even bother to acknowledge, much less answer. The captain, a man hardened by the sea, orders strict discipline. "Less talk of plague," he commands, "more talk of victory, of the mission," as if silence, as if denial had ever cured a fever or stemmed the tide of an invisible enemy. In the mess hall, the remaining men stir watery soup, their faces pale, their eyes shadowed with fear. They cough into their spoons, a nervous, almost ritualistic gesture, clinging to the belief that hot broth and routine can offer some protection against an enemy that, unbeknownst to them, is already swimming in their very blood. At night, the ship's immense hull throbs with the rhythmic beat of its engines, a deep, resonant hum. But now, blended with that mechanical rhythm, is a new, unsettling rhythm, the pervasive sound of coughs, a constant, rattling chorus that fills every space. The two rhythms merge, intertwine, until you can no longer tell which sound is the groan of metal and which is the struggle of a failing lung. One man whispers to his bunkmate, his voice hoarse with fatigue and dread, "I thought we were headed to war. Feels like we're leaving it behind and taking something worse." His words hang heavy in the air, a chilling premonition. The ship's log, a meticulous record of the voyage, notes simply, "respiratory outbreak." It's a small, clinical phrase, pressed carefully between coordinates and weather reports, a tiny, almost insignificant footnote to a burgeoning disaster. The vessel, you realize, is about to dock in Europe, ready to step onto land. But it carries with it something far more potent, far more dangerous than bullets or bombs. It carries more infected men than an entire arsenal of weapons could ever hope to contain. You are now in a muddy trench in France. The ground beneath your feet a treacherous mix of water and churned earth. The air, perpetually damp and heavy, carries the familiar pungent odors of wet soil, unwashed bodies, and the acrid tang of old fear. Suddenly, the everyday rhythm of trench life is broken. A soldier, standing near you, collapses without warning. There is no sound of an enemy shot, no scream of shrapnel. He simply falls, silently, into the clinging mud. His comrades, conditioned by the constant dangers of war, rush over, thinking he is tripped, perhaps twisted an ankle in the treacherous ground. But they freeze, their faces blanching when they see his lips. They are the color of ripened plums, a deep, unnatural purple that speaks of an invisible, suffocating force. He claws frantically at his collar, his fingers tearing at the coarse fabric, trying desperately to widen a uniform that suddenly feels 3 sizes too small, constricting his failing lungs. The trench, already a sensory assault, now gains a new, horrifying scent. Sharp, sickly sweet, like rust and rotting fruit, a smell that quickly overpowers the familiar odors of damp earth and gunpowder. Men begin to line up for sick call, a hesitant, shuffling queue forming against the muddy wall. But the line grows faster, much faster than the weary doctor can possibly write prescriptions or offer words of comfort. The urgency in their eyes is palpable, a silent plea for salvation. Gas masks, designed to protect against chemical attacks, hang from hooks on the trench walls, useless and mocking. This enemy, this invisible killer, flows through filters and cotton with chilling indifference, rendering the most advanced protective gear of the time utterly impotent. A corporal, his face etched with a desperate weariness, mutters that he would rather face a barrage of artillery shells, the known, tangible terror of enemy fire, than this unseen, insidious drowning. Rain begins to fall, a cold, relentless drizzle that mixes with the spit, mucus, and telltale streaks of blood on the duckboards beneath your feet. It washes a faint, unsettling pink river towards the trench drain, a silent, grim testament to the silent war being waged within their own bodies. A runner, tasked with carrying a vital message across the dangerous no-man's land, collapses halfway, his body falling forward into the mud. The crumpled paper, the urgent message of the war, is trapped beneath his chest, as if the war itself, the very fight for survival, has been punched from his lungs. Night falls and the trench descends into a new kind of quiet. Men cough into their blankets, trying desperately to muffle the sound, not to hide from the enemy soldiers across the way, but to avoid terrifying each other, to avoid spreading the rising panic that threatens to overwhelm them. Command reports trickle down, cold and detached. Reduced combat effectiveness. It's a sterile, clinical phrase that means something far more human, far more devastating. Half the platoon can no longer breathe well enough, can no longer stand strong enough to hold a rifle, much less fight. An artillery officer, reviewing the grim statistics, notes with a chilling precision that more men have been lost to this pervasive fever this month than to enemy shells. Above their heads, the sky is clear, a vast, indifferent canvas of stars. But beneath it, in the suffocating confines of the trench, none of them can draw a full, easy breath. You feel the heavy weight of their shared struggle, the silent, invisible battle being fought not with bullets, but with every desperate inhale. Just when the world, in its weary way, starts to adapt to this bad flu, to categorize it as just another hardship of war, the virus, with a terrifying, unpredictable will, decides to become something new, something even more deadly. You are there, witnessing the subtle, insidious shift. A robust 25-year-old sergeant, a picture of health and vitality, wakes with nothing more than a mild headache. He dismisses it, attributing it to too little sleep, too much shouting on the drill grounds, the usual wear and tear of military life. He's strong, he thinks. He can push through anything. But by midday, the mild discomfort has escalated into a raging inferno within his body. His fever climbs so high that the cold metal of his dog tags, resting against his burning skin, feels strangely, shockingly cool by comparison. The heat radiating from him is palpable, a visible tremor in the air around him. By sunset, less than 12 hours after that first mild ache, he is coughing. It's a deep, tearing sound, and with each wrenching spasm, a thick, bloody foam like dark, frothy wine spills from his lips onto a towel held by his friend, whose hands are visibly shaking with fear. He begins to plead for air, his voice hoarse, guttural, a desperate animal sound. He tears at his own shirt, ripping the fabric away from his chest as if the cloth itself is the thing suffocating him, not the unseen internal storm raging within his own immune system, which has inexplicably turned upon itself. Nurses, seasoned by the horrors of war, watch in utter disbelief and growing terror. They witness strong, young bodies, vibrant with life, transition from standing, breathing men to silent, lifeless corpses in less than 24 hours. The speed of the decline is shocking. a blur of life to death. Hospital wards, once designed with a careful capacity for 30 beds, are now grotesquely overflowing, holding 70, 80, even 100 patients. Coughing, feverish bodies lie sprawled on the floor between the beds, their desperate gasps filling every inch of space. A living carpet of suffering. Doctors, their faces grim, perform autopsies in makeshift rooms, cutting open chests to reveal the devastation within. They lift out lungs, once capable of holding the vastness of the sky, now heavy and waterlogged, like sponges pulled from a basin of murky fluid. There is no evidence of poison gas, no shrapnel wounds, no visible weapon, just the body, inexplicably attacking itself, drowning from within, caught in a storm of invisible internal panic. The virus, you realize with a cold dread, has changed. It is no longer merely a thief, silently stealing breath. It has become a butcher, brutally tearing apart the very essence of life. Coffin builders, overwhelmed by the relentless demand, work in shifts, their fingers blistered and raw from constant labor. Lumber, once stacked neatly for construction, is now piled high like firewood, ready for a winter of death that stretches on endlessly. Newspapers, attempting to categorize the incomprehensible, speak of a second wave, as if it were merely a shift in the weather, a predictable storm. But this is no weather pattern. Parents who had once feared for their sons on distant battlefields now realize with a horrifying clarity that the most likely to die from this new, brutal iteration of the disease are their strongest, healthiest children. It seeks out the most robust, turning their powerful immune systems into their own undoing. A doctor, his hand shaking, writes simply, chillingly in his journal, "They drown in their own fluids." He then closes the book, unable to bring himself to finish the sentence, the truth too terrible to fully articulate. Cities that have barely even heard of this insidious disease, far from the military camps and trenches, are about to become unwilling experiments in what happens when you pack humans together, a grim laboratory for the silent killer. You are transported to a bright September day in Philadelphia, a day overflowing with patriotic fervor. The streets, from sidewalk to curb, are packed shoulder to shoulder, a living, breathing river of humanity. 200,000 people, a sea of faces, fill every available space, their bodies pressed together, their breaths mingling in the crisp autumn air. Flags wave vigorously above the crowd, a vibrant blur of red, white, and blue. Bands play rousing tunes, their brass instruments gleaming in the sunlight, filling the air with triumphant melodies. Soldiers, fresh-faced and proud, march past, their uniforms crisp, their steps sharp and precise. The crowd roars, a collective swell of sound, their lungs wide open with patriotic cheer, celebrating valor, celebrating victory, celebrating life. Somewhere along that vibrant parade route, an ordinary man coughs into the air. He doesn't cover his mouth. In this moment of communal joy, such a simple precaution is forgotten, deemed unnecessary. No one flinches. No one even notices the tiny, invisible particles he releases into the shared air. A sick child, her face flushed a vibrant red, sits perched on her father's shoulders, her small hands gripping his hair. He believes, with a parent's hopeful heart, that her flushed cheeks are merely excitement, the thrill of the parade, not the insidious rising tide of a fever. Within a mere 72 hours, the bustling, joyous streets are replaced by the grim reality of overflowing hospital wards. Every bed, every cot, every available space is filled with people who, just days before, were laughing, cheering, and breathing deeply along that very same parade route. By the end of the week, the situation is catastrophic. Bodies, silent and still, are stacked in hallways, in stairwells, in any place flat and cool enough to hold them, awaiting their grim procession. Undertakers, overwhelmed and exhausted, are forced to turn families away, their voices hoarse with regret. There are simply not enough coffins, not enough time, not enough formaldehyde to preserve the overwhelming tide of the dead. Streets that had been vibrant with cheering crowds now host a different kind of procession. At dawn, when the city is still shrouded in a pre-morning quiet, wagons piled high with sheet-wrapped corpses move slowly, solemnly through the deserted thoroughfares, a stark, silent counterpoint to the earlier celebration. Whispers, dark and chilling, begin to spread through the city. People murmur that the parade itself had called the disease, a grim, unspoken invitation eagerly accepted by the unseen enemy. Priests, their voices weary, begin to give last rites in batches, not individually, their blessings encompassing groups of souls departing together. The city, in a desperate attempt to contain the overwhelming number of dead, orders mass graves. Long trenches are dug into the frozen soil, raw, open wounds in the earth, made to make room for thousands of people who had, only weeks before, planned to be alive, celebrating the upcoming holidays with their families. A nurse, her hand shaking from exhaustion and trauma, writes in her diary, her words stark and raw. "We created our own battlefield without an enemy soldier in sight." The grand slogans about liberty and victory, so loudly proclaimed only days earlier, now sound fragile, delicate, like paper signs wilting and dissolving in the relentless rain, their meaning washed away by the tide of death. In a city gripped by panic, the world grasps at the only visible shield it can conceive of: simple cloth over mouths. You wake to a world suddenly transformed, a landscape where cities, almost overnight, have sprouted homemade masks like a second, clumsy skin. It's a sight both eerie and deeply unsettling. Men, once uninhibited in their speech and laughter, now tie rough strips of old shirts around their faces, the cloth dampening quickly with each hot, labored exhale, a visible sign of their struggle and fear. Women, their hands accustomed to intricate stitches for clothing and linens, now work diligently, their fingers flying, stitching together neat rectangles of gauze, then pinning them over lips that still whisper prayers, gasp for air, and try to speak words of comfort or fear. Children, despite the grim reality, find a way to make sense of the new normal. You see them running down the streets, their small faces adorned with masks decorated in ink, crude drawings of animals or symbols, trying to turn the pervasive fear into a strange, unsettling game, a way to reclaim a sliver of innocence. In shops, the sounds of commerce are muffled, warped. Voices, once clear and resonant, now haggle through layers of fabric, their words coming out distorted, ghostly, as if speaking from behind a veil. Police officers, their faces stern and masked, fine citizens for daring to go maskless, as if a simple coin, a mere monetary exchange, could somehow be traded for safety, for immunity. In a hospital corridor, heavy with the scent of antiseptic and fear, a nurse, her face pale with exhaustion, carefully removes her mask for just 1 minute. A desperate moment to drink a sip of water, to feel the cool liquid against her dry throat. 3 days later, her body betrays her. She coughs, a harsh, tearing sound, and red stains the basin she holds, a chilling reminder of the virus's relentless reach. People, in their carelessness, or perhaps their desperation for normalcy, wear masks below their noses, or remove them entirely to talk loudly, trying to assert some semblance of control. The virus, ever opportunistic, slips through every careless moment, every unguarded breath, its invisible tendrils seeking new hosts. Trams rattle down their tracks filled with masked commuters, their faces obscured, their eyes the only visible parts of their expressions, looking everywhere but at the sick, afraid to meet another's gaze, afraid to acknowledge the pervasive dread. The entire city seems to breathe a new, composite odor, the sharp medicinal tang of carbolic acid mixed with the acrid smell of fear sweat and the damp, cloying scent of wet cotton. For the first time, breath itself becomes visible, not just on cold window panes, but as a public enemy, a potential vector of death. Yet despite the masks, despite the precautions, funerals continue. They are quiet, small, masked gatherings around open graves, the muffled sobs of mourners a testament to the ongoing tragedy. A grim, black humor begins to spread among the beleaguered population, a coping mechanism for the unbearable. "If you can smell a fart through it," someone whispers, the dark joke spreading quickly, "the mask won't stop the flu." But the deadliest places, you realize with a cold dread, are not the streets with their masked crowds. They are the closed rooms, the confined spaces full of young, strong men. You are back in the barracks, but it is no longer the bustling space of youthful energy. A morning roll call is attempted, a desperate effort to maintain order, a semblance of military discipline. Men line up, their formations ragged, their bodies swaying precariously. One by one, they begin dropping out of formation, not from exhaustion, but from an overwhelming weakness that simply pulls them to the ground. The air in the barracks is now a suffocating blend of camphor, a medicinal attempt at masking the inevitable, mixed with the pervasive scent of sweat, and something far more unsettling, a heavy, meat-like odor, the unmistakable scent of young bodies slowly, inexorably failing. It clings to the walls, to the uniforms, to your very senses. The medic, his hands visibly shaking, moves among the fallen, checking pulses. Each wrist he touches is hot and slick, radiating a feverish heat, like touching a fevered animal, its life force draining away. Men collapse silently between bunks, too weak, too utterly spent to even climb into their own beds. They lie there, sprawled on the floor, waiting. Sheets, once white, now stained with the grim evidence of their struggle. Sweat, blood, and the telltale pink foam hang limply from the cots like surrender flags, silent declarations of defeat. You watch as a man, his face pale and drawn, tries to stand, to make his way to the latrine, but his legs give out. He falls, collapsing heavily, knocking his head against a metal trunk. The hollow thud echoes loudly in the now quiet barracks, the sound that should draw help, but no one has the strength, the energy to even reach out a hand. The doctor, his pen moving with a grim, desperate speed, begins writing names in his ledger faster than he can administer doses of medicine. The pages, once a record of military strength, now look like a losing scorecard, a tally of lives lost. Outside the drill grounds, usually a scene of robust activity, are eerily empty. Rifles, meticulously stacked, stand neatly in pyramids, waiting for hands that are now too weak, too sick to hold them. A lieutenant, his face streaked with tears, weeps not for the abstract concept of death itself, but for the profound absurdity of losing his entire company to an illness, to an unseen enemy, before a single battle has even been fought, before they have even reached the front lines. Orders arrive from high command, cold and detached, instructing them to contain the outbreak, as if there is still a boundary, a line left to hold against the relentless tide of sickness. A chilling rumor begins to spread, whispering through the few who still have the strength to speak, that the army will bury these fallen soldiers without notifying their families, a desperate attempt to hide the true, horrifying numbers. Nobody can confirm it, but everyone in their hearts believes it to be true. Nurses, their eyes heavy with sorrow, begin saying goodbye with their gaze when they inject morphine, knowing with a terrible certainty that this might be the last moment the patient is truly conscious. the last flicker of recognition. By nightfall, the barracks are quiet, but it is a quietness that feels wrong, profoundly unsettling. There are fewer coughs now, more stillness. A deep, heavy silence descends, not of peaceful sleep, but of something far more final. Outside military fences, you realize ordinary homes are beginning to lock their doors, and, in a chilling turn of fate, many will never reopen them. You can almost see the quiet suburban street, the gentle curve of the road, the neat rows of houses. It is a scene of mundane normalcy, yet something is subtly amiss. A milkman on his routine morning rounds notices the bottles piling up untouched on a doorstep. Day after day they accumulate, their contents souring slowly under the weak, indifferent sun, their creamy whiteness turning to a pale, curdled yellow. He knocks, a polite, professional tap. No answer. He knocks again, harder this time, a deeper, more insistent rap. Still silence. The quiet is too profound, too unnatural. Neighbors begin to gather, drawn by the unsettling stillness. They stand in hushed groups on the sidewalk, their voices lowered to whispers, their eyes fixed anxiously on the closed curtains that have not shifted, have not opened in days. A collective sense of dread begins to spread, a quiet apprehension that settles over the street. When the door is finally inevitably forced open, perhaps by a worried neighbor, perhaps by a local official, the smell hits first. It's a heavy, sweet rot, the unmistakable odor of sickness and profound stillness, a scent that speaks of lives interrupted, of decay and neglect. It clings to the air, suffocating, unforgettable. In the kitchen, a pot of stew, once destined to be a comforting meal, has burned to a black, hardened crust on the stove, long out of fuel, long out of purpose. The silent testimony of a life abruptly abandoned. In the bedroom, the scene is more intimate, more heartbreaking. Parents lie together in the same bed, their bodies still, mouths slightly open, eyes half-lidded, their skin waxy and pallid. On the floor by the bed, a small child sits, clutching a doll, too weak to cry, too confused to understand why no one answers her soft, desperate pleas. Her small, innocent world has crumbled around her. The rescue team, grim-faced and efficient, wraps the bodies quickly, moving with a practiced, detached speed. They avoid looking too long at the small, innocent faces, shielding themselves from the overwhelming tide of sorrow. The child, still clutching her doll, is carried out, past the neatly stacked shoes at the entrance, leaving the house lighter in weight but forever heavier in memory, a silent testament to a family erased. This scene, you realize, is not isolated. It repeats itself again and again in other homes on other streets. Stale bread sits on kitchen tables, half-finished letters lie on desks, clocks tick rhythmically over people who will never check the time again, their lives frozen in an instant. The streets, you observe, look deceptively clean, quiet, and orderly. But behind those closed doors, in the intimate confines of ordinary homes, entire family lines are quietly, brutally erased. Local newspapers, eager to soften the blow, print euphemisms. Passed peacefully at home after a brief illness. As if brevity, as if carefully chosen words could somehow make the reality kinder, gentler. The undertaker, a man usually accustomed to the solemn rituals of death, runs out of polite words, out of soothing phrases, long before he runs out of bodies. While families grapple with burying their own, a dangerous question begins to ripple through the surviving world, a question born of fear and desperation. Where did this come from? You can feel the palpable shift in the air, the collective human need to find a cause, a source, an explanation for the incomprehensible. In America, the search for blame turns inward. Fingers are pointed, not at a foreign enemy, but at Camp Funston, the military base where the first cases emerged. It is a birthplace too embarrassing, too shameful to admit, a stain on the nation's sense of invincibility. In Europe, where the virus arrived on the shores carried by troops, whispers begin to circulate. They blame the ships, the soldiers from overseas, calling it the American disease behind closed doors, a convenient scapegoat for their own suffering. In some quarters, distant China is named the origin, an easy target because it is far away, it is different. Blaming the unknown, the exotic, is often far easier than facing the unsettling reflection in one's own mirror. Conspiracy tales begin to fester and grow, spreading like a secondary infection. People speak of poisoned wells, of enemy lab experiments, of heavenly punishment, of anything, absolutely anything, but the terrifying randomness of nature. Scientists, their faces strained with exhaustion and frustration, peer into crude microscopes, their eyes straining to see the invisible killer. But they see nothing but shadows, fleeting blurs where the virus hides, stubbornly beyond their reach, mocking their limited understanding. Religious leaders, grappling with their own incomprehension, preach about sin and divine wrath, offering confession and repentance in place of ventilation and sanitation, spiritual remedies for a physical plague. Politicians, ever opportunistic, seize upon the fear, talking about enemy germs, using the comforting, unifying shield of nationalism as a flimsy mask for their own ignorance and helplessness. Newspapers, with their insatiable hunger for sensation, publish wild theories, their ink spreading faster, much faster than any verifiable facts. Meanwhile, oblivious to the human drama of blame and accusation, the virus continues its relentless, silent journey, moving effortlessly from lungs to lungs, utterly indifferent to human arguments, unconcerned with the arbitrary borders drawn on maps. A doctor, his spirit weary, writes in a letter, his words reflecting a profound frustration. We spend more time arguing about where it came from than how to stop it. People, desperate for any shred of certainty, cling to any explanation, no matter how outlandish, that makes them less helpless, less adrift in the face of such overwhelming devastation, even if it is a comforting lie. Flags flutter defiantly over cities that are losing people faster than they are losing battles. A grim irony. The frantic search for origins, for a comfortable narrative of blame, leaves no time, no energy for the living, for those gasping for breath in their beds right now. While the world argues, a tired, broken population faces yet another surge, another cruel twist of fate. You observe the fragile glimmer of hope, the collective sigh of relief that sweeps across the world. Months have passed since the worst of the second wave has seemingly receded. People, cautious yet yearning for normalcy, try to return to their routines. Markets, once deserted, begin to bustle again. Church bells ring with renewed optimism. Schools, their doors finally reopening, welcome back children with quiet, hopeful murmurs. Shop bells, once silent, now chime cheerfully, signaling a tentative return to life. For a brief, precious moment, hope breathes, a shallow but vital inhale. Then, almost casually, almost insidiously, coughs begin to echo again. Not just isolated coughs, but the familiar rasping sounds that creep into crowded rooms, into quiet homes, into unsuspecting hearts. This time there is no shock, no sudden jolt of terror. Instead, there is only the slow, creeping horror of recognition. It's an old, familiar dread, awakening like something long buried alive, stirring from a shallow grave. A mother, her heart already weary from past fears, hears a familiar rasping sound in her child's chest. The sound is faint, yet instantly recognizable, and an old, cold dread awakens within her. a fear she thought she had finally laid to rest. Survivors, those who barely escaped the brutal clutches of the second wave, now fall ill again. Their lungs, already weakened, already scarred, are attacked anew, as if the disease has returned to finish its unfinished, brutal work. Funeral processions, once grand and solemn, now shrink. Not because fewer people are dying, but because fewer remain to mourn, the well of grief having run dry, the community depleted. People no longer ask the desperate question, why? Their questions are more immediate, more primal. Who's left? The silence is punctuated by this grim, unspoken tally. Doctors, their faces etched with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion, move automatically, their hands performing their duties with a practiced, almost robotic precision. Their hearts, you sense, are running on fumes, having already given every piece of comfort, every ounce of empathy they possessed. Newspapers, once filled with frantic, sensational reports, now print shorter, more numb accounts. Readers, you realize, no longer have room inside for more despair. Their capacity for suffering has reached its limit. Children grow up knowing the stark sight of black cloth draped on doors, a symbol of loss, better than they know the vibrant decorations of holidays. Everyone is too utterly exhausted to panic properly. The constant, insidious dread has become a background noise, a dull hum of despair that settles over daily life. When this third wave finally recedes, it doesn't feel like victory. There is no joy, no triumph. It feels instead like a pause. Just a pause, a temporary respite before the next inevitable storm. And then, against all odds, war ends. The world celebrates, but it does so on legs that can barely stand, on hearts that are heavy with unspoken loss. You are there, in the streets, as Armistice Day finally arrives. The air is filled with the triumphant peal of bells, the piercing shriek of whistles, and the raw, unrestrained sound of crying. Tears of joy, tears of relief, tears of an unfathomable sorrow. People spill into the streets, clinging to each other, breathing in one another's shared joy, a collective exhalation after years of holding their breath. Soldiers, finally home, march with medals gleaming on their chests, symbols of their bravery. But in their eyes, you see deep shadows, echoes of the horrors they've witnessed. They are greeted by families who seem thinner, paler, more fragile than they remember, etched with the unseen battles fought on the home front. In some houses, a profound, aching silence reigns. There is no one left to greet them. Victory telegrams arrive at empty chairs, delivering news to ghosts. Celebrations, even amidst the jubilation, are cut short in some places. The now familiar sound of a sudden, brutal cough slices through the joyous noise, a chilling reminder that the unseen enemy has not yet fully departed. Flags flutter proudly above neighborhoods where more people died, not from enemy bullets, but from the insidious, silent flu. A grim, unspoken truth. A veteran, his face weary, stares at long, unending rows of white crosses in a military cemetery, each one a stark testament to a life lost. He mutters, his voice hoarse with a quiet bitterness. We never fought that enemy. Politicians, ever quick to seize a moment, speak grandly of rebuilding a stronger world, of a brighter future. Yet behind the scenes, in the quiet, hushed wards of hospitals, nurses and doctors are still silently counting those who are dying, the final, lingering casualties of the pandemic. The tension is palpable, a strange, unsettling collision, the profound joy at peace, the end of a devastating war, colliding with the sour, lingering aftertaste of mass death, of a silent, unseen slaughter. Priests, their voices heavy with exhaustion, conduct services for the war dead and the flu dead in the very same ceremonies. Because sorrow, you realize, no longer fits in separate, neat boxes. The lines between battle and illness have blurred into one overwhelming tragedy. Some survivors, those who miraculously weathered both the brutal storms of war and the silent storm of sickness, feel a strange, gnawing guilt for simply being alive, as if the very act of breathing is a crime against those who perished. The guns fall silent on the battlefields, their thunder replaced by an eerie quiet. But in the lungs of 1 million people, in the persistent coughs and wheezes, you can still hear the sound of distant artillery, a memory of a war that never truly ended for them. History books begin to draft their grand chapters about the Great War, focusing on battles and generals, on strategic victories. They dedicate only a few perfunctory lines to the pandemic of 1918, a silent, almost invisible footnote to a catastrophe. The world moves quickly, eager to build statues for generals, for the visible heroes of battle, but not for the nurses who died holding basins of blood, not for the ordinary people who suffocated in their beds. Behind the parades and the monuments, lies a number, a sum of lives lost, too large, too incomprehensible to comfortably say out loud. You close your eyes, trying to comprehend the sheer scale, the incomprehensible magnitude of the loss. 50 million, 70 million, perhaps even 100 million. The estimates float through the air like restless ghosts, spectral and uncertain. No one, you realize, counted carefully while the dying was loudest, while the world was gripped by panic and chaos. The precision of statistics was lost amidst the sheer volume of suffering. Rural cemeteries, once neatly bounded, now bulge out from their old boundaries, their peaceful landscapes scarred by new rows of graves, dug in crooked, hurried lines, a testament to the sudden, overwhelming demand. Census takers, usually meticulous in their craft, find entire villages with far fewer names than before, gaps like missing teeth on official records, silent testimony to vanished communities. Nations, in a grim exercise of data, argue over statistics, debating decimal points and methodology, while mothers in countless homes stare at empty beds, their grief far more immediate, far more real than any numerical abstraction. In many households, every single photograph, every cherished memory captured on paper holds someone the flu took, a silent presence, a vanished face in a captured moment. The scale of the disaster is so vast, so unfathomable, that grief itself numbs into abstraction. People speak of millions the way they speak of miles, uttering the word without truly feeling the immense distance, the individual, crushing weight behind each digit. Doctors who once tried to keep meticulous counts quietly stop, their notebooks filling with numbers that feel blasphemous, too terrible to record. Journalists, unable to convey the raw statistics, switch from listing casualties to talking in metaphors, in grand, sweeping statements, because exact figures no longer offer comfort to anyone. The phrase "more than the war," whispered in smoky bars, exchanged in hushed tones, circulates widely. It is a resentful, bitter truth, undeniable and crushing. The pandemic, in the collective memory, becomes a rumor of a monster too big, too terrifying to fully draw, too immense to fully grasp. A century later, you reflect, historians will still disagree on precisely how many died, as if humanity is somehow afraid to utter the real, raw total, to truly confront the enormity of its vulnerability. Behind every single digit, you understand, is a ruined line of descendants who never existed, generations unborn, futures unwritten. The earth, ancient and indifferent, holds them all, without complaint, without judgment. And yet, despite this overwhelming scale, despite the unimaginable loss, the world, in its strange, often inconvenient way, decides not to remember it loudly. You observe the subtle yet profound act of collective forgetting. Cities eager to rebuild, to move forward, erect grand monuments to generals and battles, to the tangible victories of war. But there are no statues, no plaques, no quiet memorials to the coughing wards, to the exhausted nurses, to the countless ordinary citizens who simply vanished in the night. Families, you notice, do not tell bedtime stories about the terrifying time everyone almost drowned in their own lungs, about the unseen enemy that stalked their homes. These tales are too dark, too raw, too unsettling for the innocence of childhood. Men, once boys on the front, proudly speak of trenches and artillery, of courage under fire, of the tangible dangers of battle. But their voices go quiet. Their gazes turn inward when asked about the winter of fevers, about the silent, unseen enemy that brought them to their knees. Children grow up hearing vividly about the Great War, its heroes and its tragedies, but they hear little, if anything, about the Great Flu, even if that unseen killer took their grandparents, their aunts and uncles, entire branches of their family tree. Newspapers, ever hungry for novelty, for the next big story, quickly move on to new scandals, new elections, new conflicts, new dramas to fill their pages. The old headlines, once screaming with urgency, yellow and crumble in forgotten archives, their ink fading, their warnings unheard. Survivors, burdened by the trauma, suppress their memories, choosing a desperate silence, mistaking it for healing, for a way to move past the unspeakable. Doctors who witnessed entire wards die, who stood helpless against the relentless tide, rarely, if ever, talk about it. Their nightmares, you understand, do the talking instead, replaying the grim scenes in the solitude of sleep. The pandemic becomes a mere footnote in school books, an afterthought sentence, almost an aside. And an influenza outbreak also occurred. The profound absence of commemoration, the lack of public mourning becomes its own kind of monument, invisible yet towering in its silent testimony. Those who, with courage or naive curiosity, try to raise the subject at dinner parties are met with awkward shifts in conversation, with quickly changed topics, with uncomfortable silences. It is easier, you realize, to glorify the visible, brutal ballet of war, to celebrate heroes with faces and names, than to admit that a tiny, unseen thing, a virus too small to perceive, nearly ended us all. History, after all, loves heroes, loves clear narratives. A virus, an amorphous, invisible entity, has none. The dead of 1918 in a tragic double loss vanish twice, once in their bodies, succumbing to the disease, and once more in our stories, erased from the collective memory. But while memory fades, the damage lingers, deep in the lungs and hearts of the survivors. You sense the persistent echo of the pandemic, a silent presence in the lives of those who survived. Men in their 30s, once vibrant and strong, now wheeze audibly when climbing even a single flight of stairs, their breath sounding like grandfathers decades too early, a constant reminder of their compromised lungs. Women who survived the ravages of the fever find themselves perpetually tired, an unshakable fatigue clinging to their bones, as if a vital part of their strength, their very essence, evaporated with each agonizing coughing fit. Children who, against all odds, pulled through the sickness are often left with stunted growth, their small bodies never quite catching up. They develop weak chests, prone to illness, and a chronic cough that echoes through classroom walls, a persistent, unsettling soundtrack to their childhoods. Heart conditions, once rare among the young, begin to soar. People drop dead of what doctors vaguely term sudden failure in fields, in factories, in the midst of everyday life, long after the flu has officially ended, its unseen hand still reaching out from the shadows. Doctors grappling with these new, baffling symptoms record strange complications they don't yet have names for. They resort to vague phrases in their notes: post-influenza weakness, heart strain, nervous exhaustion, attempts to categorize what they cannot fully understand. Families whisper among themselves that the sickness changed their survivors, not just in body, in their physical strength, but in mood, in spirit. They become quieter, more distant, haunted by an invisible trauma, their eyes holding a sadness that was not there before. Smoking, a perverse irony, becomes increasingly popular in some circles, a desperate attempt to soothe damaged lungs by drawing in deliberate smoke, a slow, self-inflicted poison. The damage, you realize, hides in plain sight, woven into the fabric of daily life. Shorter walks, a greater need for chairs, more frequent, weary sighs at night. A survivor years later might cough once in a crowded room, and the sharp, sudden sound still makes people flinch, a collective, involuntary memory of the terror that once gripped the world. Yet, remarkably, no one truly connects all these scattered symptoms, these individual struggles, as the long, dark shadow of 1918. The pandemic leaves behind not just overflowing graves, but an entire generation of compromised bodies, forever altered. Breath remains possible, a fundamental act, but never as effortless, never as taken for granted as it was before. The virus itself is gone, but its indelible fingerprints remain, etched into the very core of those who survived. Out of this lingering ruin, you witness a slow, profound evolution. Science begins to transform, finally respecting, finally understanding what a single breath can truly take away. You are now in hushed laboratories, the air thick with the faint scent of chemicals and an intense, focused determination. Researchers, their faces illuminated by the dim glow of their lamps, dissect old tissue samples, fragile remnants of lives lost. They are trying desperately to see the invisible killer that outran them, that defeated their understanding, that defied their efforts. New tools, you realize, are invented not merely out of intellectual curiosity, but out of profound humiliation. Mankind, with all its scientific prowess, had lost a war against something it couldn't even properly look at, a microscopic foe that rendered them powerless. Virology, the study of viruses, emerges slowly, painfully, as a distinct scientific field. It begins the arduous task of naming what once was only vaguely called bad air and mystery fevers, giving form and identity to the unseen enemy. Governments, once dismissive of public health concerns in the face of military might, grudgingly accept a new, sobering truth: that public health matters as much, if not more, than guns and ships, that the strength of a nation can be undermined by an invisible foe. Hospitals, once crude sick houses, often places where people went to die, begin a slow, painful transformation. They evolve into organized institutions, complete with dedicated isolation wards and strict protocols, designed to contain contagion, to save lives. Masks, quarantines, and social distancing, measures once improvised out of desperation, crude attempts to stem the tide of death, become enshrined as formal words in official manuals, in medical guidelines. Scientists, their minds haunted by the past, debate whether another 1918-level event is possible. Most, in the quiet depths of their hearts, know the answer is a chilling, unequivocal yes. Petri dishes filled with shimmering cultures glow under the lamps like tiny, eerie suns, birthing new knowledge, slowly revealing the secrets of microscopic life. The concept of pandemic enters the official vocabulary, no longer mere folklore, but a recognized existential threat. A lingering fear of crowded spaces, of shared air, of the unsettling sound of a cough in a public theater never fully leaves the collective consciousness. It becomes an ingrained part of human behavior. A generation of doctors, shaped by the brutal lessons of 1918, carries forward a silent vow. Next time, they promise themselves. Next time, we will be ready. The world, in its haste to move on, does not explicitly thank the millions of dead for this profound awakening. But every vaccine developed, every public health protocol implemented, every scientist hunched over a microscope stands, in a very real sense, on their bones, built upon the foundation of their ultimate sacrifice. Science finally looks directly, unflinchingly, at what a single breath can hide, at the unseen dangers it can carry. Even so, you will find that every new outbreak that follows, every new crisis, will sound strangely, painfully familiar. You stand in the present, listening to the echoes from the past. Decades after the great pandemic, when strange fevers begin to appear, in Asia, in Europe, in any corner of the globe, old doctors, those who remember the silent stories, feel a cold, remembered dread, a familiar chill that runs down their spines. Charts of H1N1, of SARS, of COVID, and a myriad of other emerging diseases are laid carefully over the stark graphs from 1918. The lines, you observe, rhyme in eerie, unsettling patterns, mirroring the same spikes, the same troughs of sickness and death. Photographs of masked faces taken in different centuries look almost identical. The clothes may be different, the technology may have advanced, but the wide, anxious eyes above the cloth are precisely the same, reflecting a universal fear, a timeless vulnerability. Lockdowns, quarantines, overwhelmed hospitals. Each new generation experiences these as unprecedented, as if nothing like this has ever happened before. But the dead of 1918, if they could speak, could quietly, sadly disagree. They could tell you a story of repetition, of history's cruel habit. Researchers in their earnest efforts talk about learning from the past, about drawing lessons from history. Yet you notice humanity often repeats the very same mistakes. The initial delays in action, the comforting but dangerous denial, the pervasive destructive pride that stands in the way of truth. The panic buying of medicine, the desperate rumors of miracle cures, the anxious blaming of outsiders. The choreography of crisis, you realize, never truly changes. It plays out again and again, a familiar, tragic ballet. On television screens, experts, their voices grave, mention the Spanish flu as a benchmark, invoking its name like a ghost story for grown-ups, a chilling tale of what could happen again. People lean closer to their screens when they hear that name, sensing an old, unresolved chapter turning its pages once more, a quiet warning from the distant past. For a brief moment, the buried pandemic, the one history tried to forget, steps back into the spotlight, its dark silhouette visible, only to fade again, to retreat back into the shadows when the immediate crisis passes, when the new threat is seemingly contained. Those who take the time to read history, to truly listen to its whispers, see not prophecy but repetition. The virus of 1918 is long gone, vanished from the living world, but its echo, you realize, is clear, distinct, and haunting in every new cough that crosses continents, in every new fever that spreads through populations. At some profound level, the world knows it is living in the wake of a storm it barely recorded, a cataclysm it chose to forget. The dead of that year, in their silent graves, still speak. They speak through the graphs, through the protocols, through the solemn warnings of those who remember. Every echo, you understand, leads back to the same quiet, inescapable truth. Life is only ever one breath away from ending. You reflect upon this profound fragility, the thin, almost imperceptible line of air that separates existence from oblivion. The strongest soldiers, men with perfect physiques and shining health, the very embodiment of vitality, died like fish tossed onto dry decks, gasping, eyes wide with incomprehension, unable to understand what was taking their breath. The poorest and the richest, their lives disparate in every other way, shared the same air in crowded trams, in solemn churches, in patriotic parades. And the virus, indifferent to status or wealth, showed no preference, striking down all indiscriminately. One shallow inhale, taken too close to a stranger, one unconscious moment of shared air could be the thin thread that separated a lifetime of dreams and experiences from the cold void of oblivion. People realized, if only briefly, in the terrifying clarity of that time, that strength, that status, that even profound faith made little difference, offered no shield when your lungs, the very engines of life, filled inexorably with fluid. Breath, that most fundamental, most unconscious act which had always been taken utterly for granted, suddenly felt like a fragile, precious loan, something that could be revoked at any moment. The world learned a chilling lesson, that death doesn't always come with drama, with loud explosions or sudden violence. Sometimes it arrives in the quiet pause between two desperate attempts to inhale, in the silent, suffocating struggle for air. Behind the medals, the grand titles, the proud family names, lies the same vulnerable machinery, the delicate scaffolding of ribs, the intricate network of alveoli, the absolute dependence on oxygen. The Spanish flu, in its brutal efficiency, peeled away illusions, stripped away societal pretensions, and exposed the naked, universal dependence of all humans on a few precious centimeters of air. For many, that terrifying revelation never truly left. They slept lighter, their minds attuned to every subtle sound. They listened closer to every cough in the room, to every catch in a loved one's breath, forever changed by the memory. The pandemic whispered the same lesson again and again, a quiet, insistent mantra. You are not as solid as you think. You are not as immutable. Every sunrise, you realize, is really an invitation to breathe again, a precious gift, not a guarantee of another day. The line between life and death, between this moment and the next, is not a grand, imposing cliff, but the delicate thickness of a glass pane, momentarily fogged by your own breath. One day, it fogs. One day, it doesn't. Which brings us to tonight, and to you, lying there, breathing in the dark. Tonight, as you listen to my voice, your chest rises and falls without you commanding it, a quiet, rhythmic miracle that you rarely notice. This effortless breathing, this profound gift, is owed partly to their catastrophe, to the silent suffering of those who came before. You live in a world where vaccines exist, not as a dream, but as a scientific reality. You live in a world where viruses have names, where masks are not just strips of cloth, but scientifically designed barriers, born from hard-earned knowledge, from bitter experience. These things, these safeguards, feel normal to you only because millions of lungs once failed together, in unison, in a terrifying symphony of death. The silence of 1918, the stories never told, the names never carved into monuments, hangs subtly in the space between each breath you take, an unseen presence. Every public health protocol, every meticulously crafted law designed to protect you, every scientist hunched over a microscope late at night, owes an immeasurable debt to those who died choking in crowded wards, to those who vanished quietly in their homes. You are separated from that era by time, by more than a century, but not by biology. Your lungs are not fundamentally different from theirs. The air you draw in tonight that passes through your system has drifted across distant battlefields, through crowded hospitals, over jubilant parades, and into empty bedrooms from a century ago. If you listen closely, if you truly immerse yourself, the history of 1918 is not about abstract numbers. It's about how thin existence really is, how fragile the thread of life. This story is not meant to scare you away from sleep, not to fill your night with dread. Rather, it is meant to wrap you in a strange, profound gratitude for every easy, effortless breath you take. Somewhere, long ago, in a hushed, dimly lit ward, a nurse closed the eyes of a young soldier, his fight finally over. She whispered a quiet prayer, a silent wish that someone, someday, would remember him, remember what he endured. In a small way, by hearing this story, by allowing yourself to be present in their past, you are answering that prayer. So, as your breathing slows, as the room around you darkens, remember this quiet truth. You are the continuation of those who never woke up from their fevered nights. You carry their legacy in your very breath. If you're still awake, and if the story has stirred something within you, tell me in the comments. Where are you listening from tonight, and what do your breaths remember? And if you're already drifting away, letting sleep claim you, let the last thing you feel be the quiet, simple weight of air moving in and out of your lungs. Something millions once begged for, and you still have.